Let's see. Confirm. There we go. All right. Recording's on. All right. So here we are back in chapter 22. And this chapter, look at the title of this chapter, Descent, right? Descent. So he's talking about ancestral descent. He's talking about organisms giving rise to their offspring, blah, 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 through time. I mean, gosh, if you think about how many generations of humans there have been, it's just mind-boggling to think of stuff like that. But anyway, Darwin's adding something to that, and don't not belittle, but don't miss the significance of his understanding of geology, right? Let's go forward a little bit. Usually what I do when I start a lecture is I kind of go back and just kind of get you, remember from last week, what they used to do on the TV. It's a lot nicer, of course, now with the fact that we see each other every day, 4 days a week. So that's Aristotle and Plato, and they're saying, oh my goodness, you're imagining things, that everything is made on a certain rung of the ladder and there's nothing in between. And when you're looking at the fossil record, if you seem to see descent and ancestry, and you say, wow, these critters don't look like these critters now, but they look like maybe critters that looked like them back then when you look in the fossil record, right? And Aristotle Aristotle had big sway in the scientific community, so people kind of stuck with that for a long time, even up into the 1700s, right? William Paley and the other natural theologists. Look at that word, natural theology. Natural theology's objective was to use science, okay, was to use the classification of organism, was to use what we see on Earth as evidence to suggest the existence of a designer, whatever that designer is. And of course, back in 18th century America, Paley was an American. Yes. Anyway, I believe he was. If I'm wrong, correct me. But nonetheless, the God they're speaking about is, the Judeo-Christian God that we all hear about, right? So anyway, that was the objective of natural theology. That's why oftentimes if you read some of the older works, you go, oh, this was written by a minister. Mendel was a monk, right? So you're like, what? That's interesting. So oftentimes back then, folks who got into theology, got into religion, who were religious leaders, were also natural scientists, and they were saying, look at this beauty. And no doubt, right? I mean, man, I tell you, the awe of living things, however you explain it, even if you explain it with randomness, is just amazing to me, right? It's kind of like just looking at how it all comes together. It's just amazing to think whether something put that together, which is what natural theologists would argue with the blind watchmaker, or what scientists say is the fact that it just kind of randomly, to me, that's kind of mind-blowing, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, all right? So the whole idea here is things are made in a certain rung of the ladder. There's nothing in between. This is the philosophy at the time. This is the culture. This is like you walk around the streets before Copernicus goes, you know what, guys? We are not the center of the solar system. It's the sun. We go around the sun. You can imagine people would say, oh, lock that dude up. There's something wrong with him, right? That always happens. Oh, Wegener, the fellow that came up with the continental drift, was it South America and Africa? If you look at the way they fit together, my hands are doing a horrible job. It looks like they could have fit together, right? Wegener's theory 1963, I think it came forth. The scientific community initially called it rubbish, which is a nice English way of saying garbage, right? They basically said Wegener's theory that the continents on the planet all were together at one point and drifted apart. Now, Wegener did not have the mechanism right. It's kind of like we've been talking about with Darwin and Lamarck, right? Lamarck had the idea. Even Charles Darwin's grandfather was talking about evolution. People knew things were changing, but there was still some of the old, some of the old school stuff. Like, for example, Carlos Linnaeus, right? He was a taxonomist. Thank goodness for him, or however you look at it. He, if you didn't enjoy taxonomy, he was the guy that gave us the kingdom, phylum, class, and order thing. A way for human beings to entertain their obsessive compulsiveness. Correct? Right? Everybody likes to categorize things, don't they? All right, so remember in online classes, the more you interact with me, so when I'm speaking, when I'm talking in class in front of you, it's very easy for me to get a sense of understanding and all that sort of stuff, and I can adjust my lecture as it is. So make sure that you use, the tools we got here and online, like chatting, saying, oh, what about this? Or hold on, or go back, or give me some indication as to where we are before we go on, right? So I'm not going to stop all the time and just say ask for questions. You can do something like that. Thank you. Appreciate it. But remember, what Carlos Linnaeus was saying here is even though we were putting these organisms into categories, mammals and the birds and the fungus, and the amoeba, like well, they didn't really know much about protozoans back then because gosh, they couldn't even see them. All right, it says I'm getting really bad connection quality. Is that correct? Are you guys having a hard time? Is it video catching and all this stuff? I just got a notice that tells me something about my connection. I can turn the camera off. Okay, good. All right. If something like that happens, let me know, right? Because I can just turn the camera off. We've got to get the lecture. But anyway, see at the very end, that's what I try to do in some of these slides. I either make these little lightning bolt things, or sometimes I forget, or I circle or do something. It's like I'm trying to point out what I'm getting at in significance. We're talking about who he was, what he did, and of course, that must have been really comfortable to walk around in all day. But nonetheless, he said there's nothing about the way they're related. That's going to be really problematic to Darwin when he comes along a little bit later on with his theory, you see, right? That's going to become really a problem if you say that all these things on Earth, all of the dog-like things, dogs and coyotes and foxes and all this kind of stuff, and all the cat-like things, and holy cow, the tigers, and you get it, right? If you can say all those, even though they look alike, right, and even though they're similar to each other, if you can prove that they were made separately, that they arose on Earth somehow in the fossil record, independent of one another, if you can't trace it back to a juncture, if you can't say here come the lions and the tigers and somewhere at one point there was something that gave rise to those, man, Darwin's out the window. It's all over. His theory's shot. He laid up at night worrying about it. We're going to talk about something called the Cambrian explosion. It really was an explosion. It was rapid diversification of life. It happened 500 million years ago, but it kept Darwin awake, and he honestly died without ever quite being comfortable with what the evidence of the Cambrian explosion was saying about his theory. It's because he didn't realize something at the time. Poor guy, he didn't realize it. That's what happens. So you understand what I'm saying here? We're still dealing with this idea of did organisms, the difference that we see on the planet, has it always been that way, Mr. Aristotle, Mr. Linnaeus? I'm sorry, probably doctor, I'm sure. Dr. Linnaeus. Is it always been that way? Or was there a time when we could take these branches and branch, or I guess debranch, right? And go back to the beginning? Could we go back to one universal ancestor? Pretty big question, right? Pretty big, and it doesn't even answer one of the most important questions, one of the neatest questions, which we'll talk about in, I don't know, is that 26 or something like that, when we talk about how this life thing may have begun. And that's really, it's called biogenesis. So if I say words in class that you're like, what did you say? I'll type them, so just tell me. All right, get the idea? So that's the argument we got. That's the, let's be science, that's the alternative hypotheses. Is Linnaeus right, and the rest of his Aristotelian scale of nature, scala natura, are those guys right, or is the guys, the evolution guys, are they getting it right? Are they saying that everything kind of, the reason why they look this similar in the fossil record is because obviously they're related. So if you are in the class Mammalia, you share characteristics with mammals, but you're also related. All of us mammals are, relative term. All of us mammals are more related to each other than we are related to birds. True? All of us mammals are more closely related to each other than we are related to birds. Genetically, evolutionary speaking. Agree with me? Or disagree? I don't care. Yeah. Makes sense, right? You are more closely related to your sister than you are to your cousin. It's the same thing. We're just looking at it at a bigger level. All right, so a little timeline here just to kind of show you that science evolves. It's like peeling an onion. Oh gosh, and maybe for some scientists it's kind of sad because like in some cases with Darwin, you die before you really get the answer. Mendel had the answer about genetics and heredity already figured out. All them pea plant things that you learned about in Bio 1, that's all documented, folks. That's all written down. We rediscovered it, you see. in Darwin's time, they were like, well, I don't know how that happens. Is it blending and all that stuff that you talked about in Bio 1? And yet somewhere in some, I don't know, some library somewhere, you'd have to do the research on it. Mendel's work was sitting there waiting to be discovered. Can you imagine if Darwin would have saw them with, oh my goodness. Now he had a smoking gun. Now he had this smoking gun that said why you look like your parents, okay? Why? Because you get something from them. All right, good deal, right? Moving along. So what are geologists telling us? Does anybody remember from class the other day? What is the geologist's contribution to Darwin's thought about the Earth? What was their significant, supporting piece of evidence for him? Do you remember? What did people think? Okay, right. But what were fossils yeah, okay, right. Fossils fit into that, right? Fossils, in order to have the fossils the way they are, we have to talk about an Earth that's very, 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 very old. And why? Because y'all remember that movie, March of the Penguins? They make these little penguin steps 70 miles over the ice to go get something to eat. And then penguin steps, like maybe, 6? Some of them said the heck with it, started sliding on their bellies, didn't they? But the whole idea is, and I haven't said it to you guys yet, but I may say it probably more than once. You could eat an elephant if you did it one bite at a time, right? So the same thing is an evolution. You could literally bring those branches back to the beginning. You could document how mammals are different than, what did I say, birds? Yeah, birds, right? You could document that in the fossil record if you accept the fact that these little steps happen slowly. Now, you're going to learn later on in the semester that all of us other critters, we all evolved out of this protozoan base. I'll talk more about protists a little bit later on, Paramecium, Euglena, those guys. They were kind of the foundation of all the rest of the life forms that we have on Earth. So in other words, what I'm basically saying is that your ancestor, way, if you did the great a bazillion times, was probably a protozoan, right? More about that later on. You understand what I'm saying? We got to have a lot of time for that to happen. It can't be 6,000 years. And who remembers the other day how I told them to remember the age of the Earth? And you think, why is that important? Because when we talk about the evolution of life, you got to see it in context. About how old is the Earth? There you go. Put the decimal point, right? 4.56. So it's 4 billion. So, or you could say 4.5 billion, if you want to remember it that way. 456 is probably just me getting locked onto some sequence of numbers the way I do on things like that, right? But it's 4 billion. And how long is a billion, huh? How long is what's the average lifespan? I read it on the web the other day. The average lifespan is now 80. I think in South Korea it's 90. 91 is the I think female average lifespan in South Korea. Interesting. It's interesting because it's like, is it genetics? Is it what they eat? I mean, what makes people live longer? All right, so long time. Not 6,000, but you could certainly eat an elephant in 4.56 billion years. You could certainly walk 70 miles, little penguin steps at a time, turn around and come back. Goodness gracious, I love birds, but we're not talking about scientists here, right? All right, anyway, so where are we? Lyell publishes the principles of geology. I'm looking at the other slides. Oh, remember, in science, it's healthy to have competing theories. So even though Hutton, who appeared to not be very happy about it, Hutton was the one who said that, this erosion that you're seeing happens because the Earth is very old and things didn't happen faster in the past. Yeah, okay. Thomas Malthus said that everything is out there competing. Now, this is sort of the biological. When you develop a theory, right, many times you pull in different disciplines. That's why we always talk about in science form and function. That's why we always talk about when, back in Bio 1 in photosynthesis. You remember they talked about the structure of the thylakoids and the stroma and what's happening there and how, and hopefully you got this, and how membranes are so doggone important to cells, aren't they? Membrane, you can't do diffusion, you can't do active transport, you can't do facilitate, you can't do any of that stuff. You can't get a nerve impulse to be conducted. You can't make a muscle cell twitch unless you somehow move things across membranes. Do you remember that? That's pretty interesting, wasn't it? So we'll talk about more about that later on, right? So Malthus says, oh my gosh, there's going to be haves and have-nots, right? So there's going to be, what did Darwin get out of this? I should put a lightning bolt there. Let me draw one. There's a struggle. He might have sat up in bed maybe, right? He's reading Malthus's book, by the way, after, 1798 is when it was published. Okay, so he's reading, which is before Darwin went on his cruise, but after Darwin's cruise, he's reading his book, and I always like to think that maybe, he's flipping through, and, and he goes, Eureka, I've got it, right? This, you'll see in just a second, this struggle for existence is what kind of was the, what do you want to call it, spark, right? When you kind of go, it's kind of like an algebra when you go, God, I finally get it. Didn't happen to me very often, but sometimes. I always admired folks in which it did happen. So anyway, along comes Lamarck. Lamarck was a smart guy. We should not laugh at Lamarck. I saw on, I don't remember where it was, but there's these old booksellers, and they'll sell like first edition of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, signed by him for, a ransom. Anyway, one of them was selling one of Lamarck's syllabi from one of the classes he taught. You know that piece of paper that you get? You know what a syllabus is, but his was 400 pages long. Imagine if I plopped down a 400-page syllabus on the first day you guys sat in class with me. Here's your syllabus. Be like, yes, I'm going to add drop right now. I think back then it was different, though. I think their syllabi included their text. There weren't textbooks, so you kind of wrote your own text, okay? So maybe it was that. But nonetheless, that would be pretty intimidating. It's like my first organic chemistry exam when the teacher set it down. It must have been 40 pages. I was like, oh, good God. All right, what did Lamarck see, folks? What did he saw when he looked in the fossil record? He saw what we've been talking about, right? You can't prove, you never prove anything in science, obviously, in a way you support or refute. You get the idea. You get the importance of that? The importance of that in science is you should never exclude anything. You should always at least entertain the possibility. You might never find evidence to support it. Like my wife and I were having this discussion about ghosts one time. It's a long story, but the point is, until there's evidence to support it, I have to say that there's evidence to not support it. And that's the way science needs to be. So nobody could say for a fact that the organisms in level A, even though they look kind of like the organisms in level B and maybe those horrible things I was trying to draw the other day that exist today. Let's do a little terminology here for a second. Extinct, everybody knows, correct? Opposite of extinct, extant. So we're extant. The dinosaurs, they be extinct. So extant species that Lamarck saw running around today might have looked like the ones in level B. And of course, we all know the further you go down the rock layer, the older you get. He was saying it looked like they're related to one another. And the other folks were saying, no, you're crazy. They're not related. I don't know if they were saying he was crazy. I think he was smart. They were saying, no, I disagree with you. That even though we know that's the way it works, right, the lower down we go, the further back in time, even the geologists who, or even the geological evidence that was supporting that, still allowed people to come up with alternative theories. Let me go back to Lamarck for a second, but I want to show you that this was an alternative theory, right? No, the fossil record changing, going up in the layers and changing is not because what's in this layer gave rise to the layer above it. It's because what's in this layer went extinct, gone, open territory. Ooh, mom and dad are on vacation. Let's have a party. The other species from around came in, right? They began to repopulate the area. Whoa, they got wiped out again. Asteroid, I don't know, big mudslide, lightning bolt, I don't know, something like that. Remember, species, depending what you're talking about, could be only an acre, right? Anyway, so the point is catastrophism by Cuvier, and again, a smart guy, right? Father of paleontology. He came across his theory, anti-uniformitarianism. In other words, from a biological point of view, the changes that we see occur because the changes in the past occurred at different rates. So maybe the erosion of the river, okay, through the Grand Canyon, maybe at one time it happened faster, maybe it happened slower. Now, if you know the way it happened, the land was rising. So, of course, as it rose, the erosion would be faster because the water would flow faster. But given at a certain elevation, the water erodes at a rate. You can look at it with science, okay? Catastrophism was saying that what's going on here is in the past, certain things happened overnight, catastrophic. I mean, the dinosaurs overnight, right? Dinosaurs were whooping up on everybody back then. Us poor little mammals, which we were around for most of the dinosaurs, by the way. We were crawling around at night. And we were getting our butts kicked by the dinosaurs till the asteroid helped us out. So he says it's not evolution. Yeah. Well, okay. Ooh, God, I'm glad you brought that up. Holy cow. Thank you. Let's talk about that word evolution for a second, because we're going to talk about it a lot all semester. This class is nothing but a class about evolution. When we start talking about the different types of critters, I'm going to keep going back and saying, okay, how did these evolve from one another? Evolution means organisms change. Nobody's going to debate that. All right? Cuvier didn't debate that. Okay? I guess I should actually add down here, but not evolution per Darwin. Okay? Be very careful as we move through this information that you don't confuse the word evolution with what Darwin said. Darwin said organisms evolve. Cuvier said organisms evolve. Lots of people said organisms evolve. What Darwin did is he provided the correct mechanism. So Cuvier saying that the organisms evolved in the fossil record for catastrophism was evolution, but not based on what Darwin said. All right, now, among those theories that say evolution occurred, there were some that do occur and some that don't occur. I know, you're thinking, oh gosh, I need another cup of coffee. But really what it comes down to is Darwin gave us the correct mechanism that happens on Earth that ends up explaining all the different critters we see. Okay? Evolution is not Darwinian, or what Darwin said, but what Darwin said is evolution. Mechanism, theory. Mechanism, it was like Wegener. He said he said the continents drifted apart, okay, but he didn't have the right mechanism. I don't want to go into that. He didn't explain it correctly. Someone else came along and explained it for him. All right, thank you. Everybody cool with that? Because I'm going to use those words interchangeably an awful lot throughout this discussion, and it's easy to get confused. So, all right, this is the new slide then. Whew. All right. I know I spent a half hour, but it was so important that we go back and review that. Important for understanding where we're going to go forward. Now, what Charles Lyell did is he took gradualism, which was Hutton's theory, which was the one that Cuvier was arguing against. Now, Cuvier was wrong. Okay, he was wrong on that. It didn't occur by the way he did, but that was a competing theory. Cuvier was right on lots of other things, and he was so right on things that we actually named a very famous shark after him, the tiger shark. The scientific name of the tiger shark, and I'll be embarrassed if I misspell it, but let me see. It's I know I have the species name right, the second name, but the first one should be capitalized, by the way. Excuse me, that is a mistake, but I don't know if I got the genus right, but that's the scientific name of a tiger shark. You can't name things after yourself, so in honor of all his work, because he did some good work, we named the tiger shark after him. Cuvieri, we just made it scientific. Italian. What is it? Latin. My major professor in college worked on little tiny fish called shiners. You'd probably call them guppies, really, to be honest, a little bigger than that. But his name was Snelson, and because of all of his work that he did on shiners, later on somebody discovered a new species of shiner, and the name of it was, I'm spelling it out. Not that you have to remember this, but it is kind of cool. Notropis snelsoni, you see? So if you get really into science and discover a new species, I would appreciate a something or other Clark eye. Can't name them after yourself, though. All right, so anyway, Lyell, going back to Hutton and discounting Cuvier, was saying, yes, it was the way Hutton said. It was gradual changes that occurred through time, slowly, 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 and it's always been that way. It's always been that way. Was it that way when the asteroid hit? Well, no, but over time, leaving the Earth alone, if you will, that the processes that have occurred on Earth have occurred in a uniform process since the beginning of Earth. Now, you got to average that out, because later on we're going to talk about volcanic activity. And the early Earth has a lot of volcanic activity. But what we mean is throughout time, there weren't periods in which the changes, I put the little seesaw there to remind you that what we're talking about is geology. There's Lyell there with his really bad receding hairline. But anyway, nice comb over too. But anyway, on the left-hand side, we got erosion, right? We got rivers draining sediment, ground, dirt, that lowest part of the ladder, into the ocean. And on the right-hand side, we have the stuff that plate tectonics tells us, about plates pushing against each other, the crustal plates that Wegener talked about on Earth. They float, and when they hit, they make mountains, or they go over one another. But anyway, they force land up. The land goes up, and then the land goes down in erosion, and that's been balanced throughout life. Balance. It's an average. Doesn't happen a lot faster in the past. So he took gradualism and he extended it. He said, not only is that a gradual process, it has been the same gradual process. You get it? Since 4.56 billion years. Any questions? Avery is under my desk snoring, so if you hear that in the background, that's what you're hearing. All righty, where are we going now? Well, let's get on to Chuck, right? We've been talking about him for quite a while. So he's a young man. There he is in his dapper suit. And he decides to go around the world. Decides. Oh, my goodness, you couldn't have stopped me. Even though I got seasick in the Navy, I still got used to it. I would have loved to have done something like this. 5 years sailing around the world looking at whatever the heck you want. Whatever the heck you want, just stopping here and stopping. And now, again, the diplomacy and all the other stuff aside, we're going to focus on the biology. So here's what Darwin does. He leaves to Great Britain on this ship, the HMS Beagle. And remember, the naturalist gets seasick and says the hell with it and goes back home. So Darwin becomes the naturalist, if you will. He takes over the job. And what the naturalist job was to collect stuff. You collected it, you described it, maybe you tried to figure out what it was, but more importantly, you packaged it up in crates and you sent it back to the homeland, to Great Britain, where they tried to figure out what it really was. Maybe they went, woo, this is cool. We can make money out of this or whatever, right? So they're bouncing in around South America, and they're doing diplomatic things, and the captain is meeting with local people. So anyway, on the west coast, so the arrow's coming from the right, but it should be on the left. He climbs up in the Andes Mountains, okay? Give me a color. You can see white on white. That works, Steve. Let me see. Blue. He climbs up the Andes Mountains. So he goes up like 10,000 feet. Quite a ways up there, right? And he finds fossils. All right, no big deal. Lucky for him. I would love to find one. But he finds fossils of marine, ocean. That's what the word marine means. Ocean. Organisms. Okay? 10,000 feet up. Get what I'm saying? 10,000 feet up. How did the marine organisms end up 10,000 feet up off the surface of the water? And some of the marine organisms he found were deep water marine organisms, 10,000 feet up the mountain. How did that happen? Did they do the penguin walk? Can you measure a little thing? What do you think? Go with that. Yeah, Pangea, the continents are drifting. I get you. But what are they doing when the continents come into run into one another? They got some choices. One can go below the other one, or like if you took your hands and put them together, well, what happened if I push these together? Neither one went underneath the other one. Right? What do you mean connection? Yeah, they would connect and then they would push against one another, right? So if one couldn't go over the other one, they would force up a mountain. Look online, and this thing doesn't switch over to online very well anyway, but look on a picture of the Matterhorn mountain in Switzerland. If you look at the Matterhorn the right way, from the right angle, it's one big rock layer over another one. They came together there in, was that Switzerland? Those rock layers from Africa and Europe came together, and they ran into one another. The African one kind of pushed up over the top of the, I wish I could show you a picture. Anyway, that's how they got up there, right? The marine organisms got up there because at one time they were the bottom of the ocean, all right? And then they pushed and they pushed and they pushed. They went up 10,000 feet from some cases where they were, were really, really low. That would take a lot of time, wouldn't it? I mean, that's not going to happen overnight. I mean, the Himalayas are growing, so if you want to go climb Mount Everest, you better do it now because it gets higher by the year. 2 centimeters a year, I think. What's that, an inch? So the Himalayan mountain, Mount Everest grows by 1 centimeter a year. So these things ain't fast. So all these things to happen are going to happen slow. Now, did Mount Everest form faster in the past? No, 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 no. Charles Lyell would say no. That maybe there were times when the rocks pushed a little harder than others, but overall it averaged out to a relatively very slow rate. I mean, North America and Europe are drifting apart, but we're doing it by fractions of an inch a year, or maybe more than. I think it's not very much. You can look it up. It's, I mean, you don't have to worry about paying more for airline fare to fly to Europe because it's getting further away, right? So this is time. All right, so then he noticed when he's in Chile, he experiences the fact that Chile has an awful lot of earthquakes that is very active tectonically, and he sees a lot of evidence of rocks that have been pushing against each other. I mean, you don't got to be a Wegener geology guy with plate tectonics 100 years prior to that to kind of go, that's weird. It does look like they push over one another. Or that's weird. A mountain, I mean, gosh, with this high up, it's got these marine organisms, right? And they're fossils. There ain't no crabs up there today, right? But there are these fossils of it. So that's cool. Now, I'll talk more about the Galapagos Islands, but this was an incredible insight that he had because it was I've never been there. I really need to go there. It was a living laboratory. We love that biologists. Oh my God, we go freaky over living laboratories where we go out into the nature and we've talked about things that we theoretically think should happen, and maybe we've even kind of did them in the lab, and we go out and we go, wow, nature is doing the same thing. Now, I don't want to spend a lot more time on that, but the Galapagos was significant because it gave Darwin ideas about how species are created. I don't know why I'm spelling species. You know how to spell species, right? So how did we go from different types of dogs, right? How did we go from different types of dogs? Where did it happen where dogs and cats were together? So that's what he was kind of doing. So you might, and in the Galapagos Islands, he was seeing really good evidence of how, for example, dogs and coyotes are related. The scientific name of your dog. Anybody know what the scientific name of the common puppy dog is? Do you know what was that? And this is coyotes. Coyotes and dogs are very closely related, right? Very closely related. Well, how did those things become species? We'll talk about that in our next chapter, but that's what the Galapagos did for Darwin. So he sails back around the world 5 years later, and he's thinking about all these things, right? He's thinking about everything he's seen. He's thinking about the fact that when he went to the Galapagos, there you go, what do we have now? 13, and I've even seen 15 species. Now, what's significant about this, and I'm kind of doing a little bit of foreshadowing, is later on we're going to talk about all of these species on that group of islands. Let me give you that word now because I'm going to say it. A group of islands. Is it I? Is that how you spell it? Something like that. Archipelago. That's Hawaiian Islands are an archipelago. Group of islands, right? Anyway, out there on that Galapagos Islands archipelago, those 13 or 15 species of finches, all doing different things. Some are woodpecker finches and cactus finches and blah, blah, blah. We'll talk more. Some eat insects. They all came from one species. One species. We believe they all evolved from one species. But put that on hold. We'll talk about it later. So that was what was really significant to Darwin. One of his significant things. So he comes back, and well, check this out. I love this. This is his notebook from 1837. When was the Beagle? 1840 after he got back. So this is when he's on the Beagle. All right, so cool, even better. So he's on the ship and he's writing a note to himself. You see, he's taking notes. And I don't know what all this is over here, but I love this. Check it out. He goes, I think this is what happened. I think that what happened is the reason why all them species that I saw on the Galapagos Islands, I think why they all are kind of similar, although different from one another, different species. I think because at one time they were all an ancestral species. There was one that gave rise to all of them. So he's drawing a family tree here. He might say A are the mammals, and then B are the birds, and C are the lions, and of course there's subdivisions within all that. Then that just kind of, I don't know, man, that just kind of gets me going to think. This is when he went kind of a little. We always think that scientists, and sometimes it happens, it is a big eureka moment, but sometimes it's a little beep, beep, beep moments. You kind of go, oh, and then you go next step, go, oh. It was, maybe it was me in math. Again, didn't go very far, but I did. Anyway, here's what he's saying. Here's his thought. Here's what I think translates into. He goes, okay, stuff that's around today descended, came from, evolved from, changed from something that was ancestral. Does not seem like a big thing, does it? But remember, we have competing theories. We have, Cuvier saying about catastrophism. We have natural theology. We have a lot of them folks out there. And not only is what Darwin's saying controversial in terms of science or new, it is socially controversial. All right, there are some issues involved with that. So Darwin, of course, being a very, what do you want to call it, very organized individual, was going to make sure he had all of his ducks in a row. And that's why these things that we'll talk about, the Cambrian explosion. Oh, yeah, flowers, too. He was like, oh, my gosh, where did all the flowers come from? He didn't quite understand a few things about his own theory, poor guy. So anyway, he had this idea, this mechanism. There you go, the mechanism. So here he's got the theory. This is evolution. And he's trying to figure out what is the mechanism. So yes, Wegener, the Africa and South America fit together. Yes, that's obvious. It looked like a puzzle. But what pushed them apart? Why aren't they together anymore? So why aren't these all the same species of finch, for example, anymore? Or why aren't the dogs and the cats and the lions and the bears, oh my, oh gosh, let's throw in the fungi as well and the plants. Why aren't they all the same? What is the mechanism? So here's where he's reading Malthus's thesis. He goes, oh, there's going to be haves and have-nots. There's going to be a struggle. Now, what's that struggle going to mean? What do you think it's going to mean? What do you think that struggle is going to mean? Let's look at just a group of individuals of the same species. We're going to call them a population. So let's look at a population of squirrels hanging around Lake Sumter campus. What are they struggling to do? What are you struggling to? What are all of us living things struggling to do? Don't get too metaphysical on me. Just think about it biologically. Yeah, alive, right? We're all struggling to stay alive, and we need certain things to do that. We need shelter, we need food, we need protection, blah, blah, blah. All those things that are very basic to humans or basic to organisms on Earth, aren't they? You got to have a way to survive, because the opposite of being alive is not alive, correct? And the reason why you want to survive, biologically speaking, the reason why you survive biologically speaking, again, I am preface that by saying biologically because I want you to focus on that part. What is the reason that you are to survive biologically? Why do you struggle to survive? What is that purpose? Again, don't get metaphysical on me, right? Just think about it biologically. You may have already engaged in this purpose. You may be going to engage in this purpose. You may not ever engage in this purpose, which means nothing about you, of course. But biologically, there is a purpose of what living things do. There you go. There you go. Isn't that it? It's all about reproducing, whether you do it sexually or asexually, however you do it, whether you're a plant, whether you're a moss, whether you're a lion, a tiger, a bear, whatever you're doing, you want to live long enough to reproduce. Now, it's very cold, I understand, but in biological terms, if you do not do that, if you do not do what Desiree just wrote, you biologically don't exist anymore. You see what I'm saying? You went extinct. You're, in Darwin's picture, you're this little line right here. You didn't make it. I assume what Darwin was trying to show was this was present day. Oops, I erased all that. Forgot to get a pen color. This was present day, and this was a critter that's no longer around. Right, like the dinosaurs. They didn't live long enough. Now, let's do a little math. Very simple little math. It's a true-false kind of math question, so to be very simple. Do you believe you would leave behind more children if you live longer or if you don't live as long? So in other words, who leaves behind more offspring? Those who live longest or those who die earliest? Now, I know there are exceptions, but overall, I keep reaching for that. Yeah, makes sense, right? You know, females remain sexually available, sexually possible, physically able to have children up until, it varies by species, right? Menopause, what we call in humans. Males, in many cases, are able to father offspring well into their old age. So The whole idea is what we're trying to do is produce offspring, and the longer we live, the more offspring we produce. Okay, so now you're getting it, right? So Darwin is getting it too. He's going, okay, here's what's happening. This is what happened. We've got this struggle for survival. All right, now, if you live longer and you produce more offspring, and if we're talking about a group of squirrels again, just a group of squirrels, what does that mean the squirrels are going to be like genetically 100 years from now? I hope I'm phrasing that question right. Think about the reproduction part. That group of squirrels 100 years from now, you're dead, your direct descendants are all dead, but you know, your great grand squirrel son, or whatever the heck they're called. Do the math. This is like Darwin going ding, the whatchamajigget, the light bulb. So if I have 10 children and you have one, and then we come back in 100 years and there's a 100 people, probability says more of those people would be related like me, who had 10, or like him or it or whatever, who had one. Think about it again, or else I worded it wrong. We've gone ahead into the future. Me, there were a lot. I had 10. He had 1. I can't do twice that on my other hand. Okay, I had 10. He had 1. That 1 may have had X. However, my 10 would have had X. Whatever. If we come back in 100 years, genetically, if we looked at the genes, would there be more my genes in the population or more his, or hers, or whatever? Let's see if I can get a visual out of this, because, yeah, it's numbers, isn't it? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm sorry, I probably wasn't explaining that right, but let me see if a visual helps. So we go forth from me, and I had 10 kids, and they had kids, and they had kids, and they had kids. We're going 100 years. So what's that, 5 generations? Let's go 1,000 years, whatever you want to do, right? And that's because at the beginning here, I had 10. What I got, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. I'm not going to draw 10. But here is the other dude, and he had 1. Now maybe that 1 had a lot, right? And maybe but it doesn't matter. Go 100 years, right? We say ding time, or 1,000 years, whatever. There's more me genetically in the population than him. You see? Now, throw in one more thing, and you got this evolution theory figured out. The change that occurs, this struggle for survival, is decided by the same thing that Lamarck was hinting about. Let me go back to that slide now. Come on, one more. No, 2 more. There we go. All right. The same thing that Lamarck was talking about, right? The environment was what was causing a struggle. Resources. See, the little Okapi giraffe ancestor used to feed on the ground where everybody else did. It was a browser, like sheep and all them other things. And it got as much as it could based on who else was doing that. But then there was this opportunity, this situation, environmental opportunity of this green stuff that you could eat that was up higher. If I could only reach up higher, I could eat as much as I want, because these guys down here, they ain't got a neck like me. Now, Lamarck said the mechanism was to stretch, but now you know it wasn't to stretch, was it? Go down below. All right, you see how it's working there? Like we're talking about all the reproduction that was occurring to stretching. Now, you explain to me why those necks of the giraffes got longer. Not because of stretching. Now, if you want to turn your mic on, you can. But explain to me why through time we went from a short-necked ancestor up here to a long-necked descendant. It wasn't the fact that they stretched. They were adapting to the environment. Okay, what were the longer neck descendants of that first ancestor? Go right up to the very left. So we got a bunch of these guys born. Some are born with longer necks, some are born with shorter necks. It's just the way things are, right? Things are different, right? Some people are taller, some are shorter. Some giraffes have a longer neck now than others. So back then, some would have had a longer neck. So what would those longer neck giraffes been able to do versus the ones whose necks were average or maybe even short? Better, right? Because they could get food better, couldn't they? And if they could get food better and survive better, then they could do what better or more? There you go. And if they could reproduce more in 100 years of giraffes or 1,000 years of giraffes, if we looked at the genes, whose genes would be there? The way back at the beginning, the longer-necked ancestors? There you go. See how that works? It's all numbers. All right, here's a cool word for you. The way evolution works, you'll see it again, but I might as well introduce it here, is through a process, if I could spell it. This is what Darwin's theory was. This is why it's important that you understand that evolution and Darwin is not the same. Darwin said evolution, all right, by his process results in adaptation. You guys mentioned it a few times. You got to adapt. You don't adapt. Madeline just said a few minutes ago, adapting the environment. That's correct. If you don't adapt, Mr. Dinosaur, you go extinct. You're not extant. You're extinct. So you got to adapt. And the way you adapt is you don't. You're born the way you are. But groups of you adapt. What we call populations, members of the same species, all them squirrels, all us humans. We adapt. We change to a changing environment. Why does environment change? Talk to the geologists. It changes, okay? They got evidence to support that. As the environment changes, those who figure out, hey, look at this. All I gotta do is eat this stuff up here. Now, my buddy over here, who's the same guy, same species as me, he was unfortunately born with an average neck. So guess what? He feeds on the ground with all the other doggone stuff you got to deal with. One of the things that happens with browsers that feed on the ground is they're more exposed to parasites too, because guess what else happens on the ground? You may feed on the ground, but you're also on the ground, correct? So if you're feeding along and you don't detect that, well, anyway, you might end up getting a few parasites, and that could make you sick and blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. You live longer if you raise your head. You live longer if you were born with the ability to feed up higher. That's a pretty cool theory, right? Now, that's Darwin's theory. Remember, I've emphasized that evolution, organisms can change, but Darwin said the mechanism was by organisms adapting through that differential reproductivity. Those who live longest are doing so because they survive, because maybe they take advantage of their environment better, they can eat that higher stuff, and they have more kids. Now, if you'd only knew Mendel meet Darwin, Darwin meet Mendel. If you'd only knew Mendel, he would say, eureka, I got it. That's what it is. You pass on these things called genes, which Mendel already wrote, huh? Makes you wonder what else is out there like that. Okay, now, here's the thing that happens in human. His buddy, a guy named T.H. Huxley. I don't know what the T.H. stands for, but Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog. He was an advocate. You understand what I mean, an advocate? He was loud, advocator. Anyway, he was an advocate. He would go to these talks and he would shout down these people. Because, like I said, a lot of social, a lot of scientific stuff going on. And that's the way science works, basically, even just science. You're competing. You're trying to sell your theory to someone. And you got people who don't agree with you. And some of them are pretty prominent. You know, you go up against a Cuvier type guy and people go, what are you, Mr. Youngstar Mr. Darwin? And you're saying he is wrong? But whatever. I don't know why I did is that a French accent? Anyway. All right, so he's kind of debating. He's like, I don't know, they're TH. I don't know, Darwin, Bulldog. I don't know, man. I need to make sure everything's right. He gets a letter. Gets a letter in the mail. Whoop. You don't know me. I don't know you, but my name is Alfred Russel Wallace. Nobody ever hears about old Alfred Wallace, so let's give you his middle name. 2 L's in Russell? Yeah, anyway, poor guy. So anyway, he gets a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace in June of 1858, and Alfred Russel Wallace lives in the Malay Archipelago. You're like, oh, that sounds cool. It is cool. It's over there off Indonesia, in that area, Pelago. Indonesia, Southeast Asia, that kind of area. I believe his parents were missionaries, if I were right, or did something with the British government. Anyway, he contracts malaria. And we'll learn about malaria later, but one of the symptoms is you get fevers, okay? And sometimes when you get fevers, you know that you might even, if they're long enough and severe enough, you might even hallucinate, starts messing with your brain. Well, according to Alfred Wallace, he writes a letter to Darwin in June of 1858. He says, hey, Chuck, I'm a biologist over here. He's actually well known for quite a few things. He's actually got something named after him called Wallace's Line. Wallace's Line is a line on Earth that explains why Australia is so weird. More on that later. But anyway, remind me to mention Wallace's Line. If I don't, then anyway. All right. He says, I live over here in the Malay Archipelago, and during a fever fit when I was having malaria, it's like, ooh, check this out. He hallucinated this mechanism, right? He's an evolutionist too. Organisms change. Most scientists aren't debating that now. Most scientists say, okay, evolution is working. What's driving it? What's driving it? This is what Darwin's trying to explain. And he says, I had this idea of the mechanism. And Darwin goes, whoa, same thing I wrote. Same idea I had. Same idea I had. Right now, if you were in a calculus class and you did problem 14, and you came up with some weird calculus answer, and you were like me, and you're like, oh, I don't know if I did that right, you might contact a buddy and say, what'd you get on 14? And your buddy would say, I got blah, 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 blah. 5 pi, 3, whatever the heck all that stuff meant. And you go, oh, same thing I got. What are the odds you got it wrong? 2 independent people working on it. You weren't working in the same room. Your buddy's in his house. You're in your house. What are the odds that you both got the same wrong answer? If it's calculus, it's a good odds that you got the wrong answer, but same wrong answer? Come on. What do you think? You're students. Did I lose connection? No. What happened, y'all? Yeah, come on. You're not going to come up with the same wrong answer. You might come up with a wrong answer, which I usually did, but you didn't come up with the same wrong answer. So Darwin, you see what this is? This supports his hypothesis. This is an independent observer looking at his critters over in his part of the world, and Darwin doing his round the world thing, and they had never met each other. They might have known about each other, okay? You hear about scientists, but he writes him this letter and says, hey, I got this idea. Now, Darwin did it through observation, and Wallace did it through observation too, but apparently he says the spark was, hallucinating during malaria. I'm like, man, I tell you, if that's what happens to you when you hallucinate due to malaria, having a fever and malaria, that's not such a bad thing. Now, we don't hear a lot about Wallace for a variety of reasons. Darwin didn't steal anything from him. They actually presented their evidence together in front of the Royal Society of, a bunch of wig-wearing guys or something like that. But they parted ways when it came to Darwin's theories about the evolution of man and so on and so forth. That's a good topic for I took a history of biology class in college. That was really cool. All right, now Darwin needs some more evidence. And one of the evidences that he has is that in a laboratory, and essentially what's going on in agriculture, when we breed things from each other, that's a laboratory of genetics and evolution. In a laboratory, we can simulate natural selection, which we'll talk about in a minute. We call it artificial selection when we simulate it. When you breed for something, if you're a dog breeder, a horse breeder, a pigeon breeder, if you're a breeder of wild mustard, you can make all these different things. That's where Brussels sprouts and cabbage and broccoli and kohlrabi, which I've never had, and kale, which doesn't taste very good, and Brussels sprouts, never eat food that smells that way. Cabbage, kind of the same. I do like coleslaw. I do like broccoli. All right. So anyway, you get the idea? Artificial selection works. You've done it. Now, we call it artificial because humans are involved. You go pick the stuff to breed. If you want to breed your dogs to bring, to make champion line, whatever dogs, you pick the stud or you pick the female, correct? All right, so that's not, and Darwin is around during the industrial era, during the period when we begin to advance, when we begin to increase that resource line that Malthus talked about, right? We started growing better crops, more efficient crops, and breeding different things out of crops, and that was going on way back even at Darwin's time. If you were a dairy farmer, you might breed female, female cows. You might breed cows who were good milk givers. They give a lot of milk. Maybe there was something about them. Maybe you didn't understand the Mendel stuff, but come on now. I breed old Bessie there, and every time I do, her female offspring are good milkers, good milk givers, whatever you would call it if you're a milker. Natural selection, though, what was the deciding factor here? There ain't no farmer walking around. There's nobody going, okay, take this critter and put them together, right? That's artificial. So what's the mechanism here? It's similar to artificial selection, but Darwin's important distinction was the decider, if you will. You get what I'm saying? The decider. Who decides in artificial selection who breeds? Who decides? Who decides who breeds? Madeline? Desiree? Who decides who breeds in artificial selection? Exactly. Who's the breeder in natural selection? You see, that's the crux of his theory, right? Now, here's the book he wrote on the origin of species. They always gave these books long names. But if you notice now, the origin of species, okay, this is evolution at its largest extent. This doesn't explain how squirrels get longer or shorter ears through time. They're still squirrels. Darwin's saying, how do we get all them finches? How do we get squirrels and mammals and birds and, all that other stuff? So he's talking about the origin of species, and here's the mechanism, he says. Here's how it happens. Natural selection. And then he has other parts. Look, check this out. He wasn't a PhD. It's Mr. Charles Darwin. And a master's. Now, it published this in 1859. You see up there in the date. And this is what it does. This is what it helps do. And this is the goal of science, to come up with theories and mechanisms that explain things we see. Right? To explain things we already see. We notice, obviously, that life is extremely diverse. There's, however many species we talked about. Does anybody know? Give me a unifying factor of life, though. Unity and diversity. Those words seem totally opposite. But what's a unifying factor of life? What's one thing that all life shares? You all have Bio 1. Your very first chapter would have told you that. All living things, okay, right? So they use their metabolism so they can reproduce. All living things have cells, but what characteristics do cells? There's one of them. Give me another. What characteristics do cells have? They're within 5 or 7, typically. It depends on how you break them apart. What's another one? Reproduction is a characteristic of life. I already mentioned metabolism. We're talking about evolution. You gave me reproduction. You got one more, or at least one more in my view. What's another thing that living things do? If I took a needle to you in class Monday and stuck it in your arm, what would you do? Yes, that's true. Yes. Okay. If I wrapped you on the hand with a ruler, not heavy, just a little bit, what might you do? Yeah, I don't mean to wrap you that hard, but you would respond, wouldn't you? You might stand up and hit me back. Living things respond, don't they? Living things respond. So there's some things that do unify life, not to mention carbon, by the way. We didn't even go chemistry on you. Carbon is a unifying thing of life. We're a carbon-based life form. When I say we, I'm talking about all of us on Earth. All right, it also explains this thing that Darwin observed as he traveled around the world, right? That's what I always tell people to do. Get out and see the world. You can learn a lot of things. In Africa, in South America, on the Galapagos, down in the South Pacific, wherever he went, he looked at organisms and he said, wow, they all seem to be adapted to their environment. Now, that seems kind of an obvious thing. In other words, they seem to fit. If an organism is an anteater in South America and an organism is an anteater in Southeast Asia, separated by a big ocean, they both tend to have long snouts and sticky tongues. You get it? Now, real obvious, if a bird flies in South America and in India, they both got wings. So you get that? So this idea that organisms fit in there with their environment. Obviously, the idea is if you don't fit, right, if you don't match, whatever you want to call it there, if you're not efficient in your environment, you don't live very long. If it's really advantageous to have wings and you don't have them, sorry about that. It's like that great Gary Larson cartoon with the deer that was born with a birthmark that's a big bullseye on his side. And one deer says to the other, oh man, bummer of a birthmark, Hal. That's so funny. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, so this is the descent with modification. Look in the red what I wrote. All critters, all are related through descent from some ancestor. They lived in the past, way in the past, and through time, they're modified because, please don't forget the because, it's the environment. Organisms aren't going, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have to understand the changes that are occurring in the environment, weather, topography, a mountain, a lake is being formed, predator, all those kinds of things that we'll talk about. We have to keep that in mind when we talk about organisms changing. If that doesn't change, organisms won't change. As a matter of fact, that's what Darwin called evolution at the beginning of his first edition of The Origin of Species. He didn't even use the word evolution. He used descent with modification. The reason why is he wanted people to understand that he was proposing a different mechanism to the observations that everybody was making, that things had changed. So like if we looked at elephants, and I think this has actually even changed since, I believe now we're up to, I think 5 species of elephants. Now, the way you read these along the bottom is a timeline. The present is the right on the line on the far right. If the line touches the line, then you're still around. You're extant, like hyraxes. Manatees, check it out. See, manatees are distant relatives of elephants. Now, this is a cool chart because what it also allows you to do is tell when. It looks like, if you follow the back, right, through the elephants, through the mammoths, all that sort of stuff. It looks like manatees and elephants shared a common ancestor. About how long ago would you say? About how many years ago? I'll get rid of my scribbles. So I'm talking about elephants and manatees. When did they share? When did their common ancestor live? It's not around today, but if you dug down in the rocks, you'd have to dig down until you reached a rock layer that was about how old? There you go. The dinosaurs died off, by the way. Mammals went crazy after dinosaurs died off, obviously. Dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago. Now, what about this Baratherium? Okay, where is Baratherium? Are there any Baratheriums running around today? Are there any mammoths? Are there any mammuthus? Where are those guys? Are they around today? Or even this one, which I won't even try to say. No, they're gone. See the line? It doesn't go up to the present, does it? Now, if you want to say which one of the extinct one here, which one of the extinct species is most closely related to the modern elephants, whether 3 or 5 species, and I'm pretty sure it's 5, or maybe even more. Which one of the extinct ones is most closely related to it? You can draw on the screen if you like, or you can type it in. There you go. Anybody got any? Everybody understand how Desiree came up with that? Anybody got any questions? Who's next then? Instead of somebody beyond Desiree, who's the next fossil critter that's most? It's not as related as Mammuthus, but who's the next one? All right, beyond that one. You went too far back. Go right there. Oops. Right there. There you go. See how that works? Isn't that cool? And you can figure that was, so gosh, the scale gets a little wonky there. 15, 18 million years ago, something like that. Okay, we'll look more at those later. Those are kind of cool, right? They're like family pedigree chart things. All right, now, important slide right here. This is why I give you the slides so you don't write this stuff down. Listen to what I'm saying here. Here's what Darwin says. Darwin's principles of evolution. Everybody's talking about evolution. Darwin says, here's my mechanism. Now, in subsequent chapters, there are other mechanisms. Darwin's mechanism is the only one that results in organisms adapting. It's the only one that explains why organisms are on Earth the way they are, because they've adapted their environment. It's as simple as that. All right. Here's some premises of his, here are the premises of his theory. All species can make a lot of offspring. We all have great potential fertility, right? I worked on a species of eel in college that the female, oh gosh, every season would produce about 250,000 eggs. Because you know, we've talked about it. What's going to happen with most of those offspring? They're not going to survive, are they? So if you're going to make a lot of offspring, you're betting on the fact that the environment's going to chew up quite a bit of them. Sea turtle females lay about 100 eggs per clutch. That's what a group of reptilian eggs is called. Bird eggs too, a clutch. About 100 eggs per clutch. We estimate that 1 in 1,000 sea turtles lives long enough to reproduce itself. And remember, I said biologically, your purpose is to perpetuate the species. So out of 1,000 sea turtles that hatch, only 1 makes it through the rigors of life to live long enough to become sexually mature, male or female, and then reproduce. So it can pass on its genes. Yet, when we look at that, of course, we know we're not up to our butts in sea turtles, right? So theoretically, populations could grow big, 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 but they don't. They're kind of stable. Well, that's because there's something pushing against it. If you're pushing against a door and it's not opening, okay, what's that pushing against it? That struggle for survival that Darwin talked about. Why? Because there's only so much in an ecosystem. Go back to Malthus's graph, right? Oh, in blue. And that, right? Not as good as that, but anyway. All right, struggle for survival. That's why it is. All right, now, what is the deciding factor? Not everybody's the same. Variation exists in a population. Let me define a population for you. A population, very specifically, is a group of conspecifics that have the potential to breed. Conspecific, same species, potential to breed. They have the opportunity to breed. One population of gray squirrels around Lake Sumter, one population of gray squirrels in Miami. They're both the same species, yeah, but they don't have the potential to interbreed, do they? What's the odds of a squirrel around Leesburg making it to Miami and vice versa? You get that? Okay, now, finally, and this is where the Mendel thing comes in, whatever this, an advantageous variation you might have, if you're rabbits, maybe born with longer ears, you can hear predators, right? Maybe if you're a bird, maybe if you're born with this special type of wing called an alula. It's very cool. I'll talk about it later on. Maybe that gives you an advantage. All right. Whatever that variation is that gives you an advantage, maybe your neck is a little bit longer. Thank you, Mr. Lamarck. You pass it on. Darwin didn't know how, so there's where another mechanism is necessary. That's why it's like an onion. You peel off a layer at a time. But you look like your parents because you get something from them. I mean, we understood the sex cell thing, okay? It was still, remember back in the chapter 14, back in Bio 1, what is DNA? What's it look like and how it works, okay? Down below, I put in a box so you understand, very important that you understand the difference between these two. Differential reproductivity, simply put, the longer you live, the more you reproduce, the more the future's going to look like you. That's actually pretty good. The longer you live, the more you reproduce, the more the future's going to look, genetically, going to look like you. Mother Nature, through Darwin's theory of natural selection, does not work by differential mortality. Differential mortality might be best put as weeding out the weak. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Darwin's theory, because weeding out the weak implies somebody decides who's weak. What Darwin's theory talks about is something called fitness. Fitness is how adapted you are. Your neck's a little longer. You got an alula. Maybe you're a little more of a hydrodynamic shaped fish. Whatever that is, that gives you greater fitness. Living longer, having more offspring, making the future look more like you. More fish are going to be streamlined. More birds are going to have an alula. It's a thumb feather, by the way. Okay, you get it? Differential mortality. Mother Nature doesn't work by weeding out the weak, just like Lamarck and his giraffes, the short-necked giraffes, the medium or the average neck giraffe ancestor, excuse me, they lived, they fed on the ground. Okay? It was the longer neck ones that lived better. More food, more resources, stronger, better able to deal with predators, disease, live longer, reproduce more long-necked individuals born in the future. The reason why you have a long neck is because it's genetic. Whew. Get that? All right, that's what this slide is saying. Look down below. See, now this is a little bit misleading. Natural selection doesn't X out the weak, okay? It's just saying numbers-wise. It's all numbers. Everybody's reproducing. That's why it's called differential reproductivity, different rates. You reproduce faster, you live longer. We'll do a little more with that in some subsequent chapters, but that makes sense, right? Everybody's reproducing, but if you reproduce more because you got some variation that's advantageous. Now, How you got that variation, yeah, we'll talk about that in the next chapter. How you got different. Now, you already know some of that. It's genetic, obviously. Not all your brothers and sisters look like you. What time is it? Okay, unless you have an identical. All right, let's look at a couple of the evidences that Darwin had. So, I'm sorry, for evolution. Some of these Darwin was aware of, and some we found out later on. Okay, there are 4 types of data right now that we look at. First are direct observations, things we see happening, and if you work in the medical field, you'll appreciate that. The example I'll show you on that. Something called homology. Remember in science, homo means same, like homeostasis, right? Again, the fossil record, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. We have talked about that, but there's a couple things about that I want to show you that comes out of the fossil record that's interesting. And biogeography, which is just a nice way of saying, why do critters live where they live? Why do fish live in the ocean? Why do polar bears live in the poles? I know it seems very simple, but if you get down at the very granular level, why does this species of fish live in this kind of water or this kind of environment? And, you know, there's the environment, right? So we'll talk about that. All right, direct observations. If you work in a medical field, you know that Staph aureus is a constant battle in hospitals and so on and so forth. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria, and we'll talk more about it later on. It's commonly found in people, but it's different strains of bacteria that cause the problem. Like E. coli. E. coli, we always get the bad news about E. coli, right? You have E. coli in your gut. It's a normal resident, they say, of the lower intestinal gut of warm-blooded vertebrates, like you and myself. Yeah? That's the strain of E. coli is the problem. So think about strains as being, say, breeds of dog, right? So it's the strain of Staph aureus, and there's a particular strain of Staph aureus that is a pathogen. Now, not some Staph aureus is pathogenic, some is not. Pathogen is disease-causing. If you're a pathogen, you cause disease, right? So some of the Staph aureus strains are a pathogen. Now, many of them are pathogens, but this one is particularly dangerous because it's evolved a resistance. It's evolved a resistance to an antibiotic that is used a lot in medical facilities. It replaced penicillin in 1961. You see down below, and penicillin, which was a great antibiotic, 1945, and in 1961, methicillin, another type of antibiotic, was used. Okay, now here's the problem. Look at the chart. From 1993 to 2005, the annual hospital admissions with MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, so MRSA stands for, has increased. Why? Because we're actually engaging in artificial selection, right? When you take these Staph aureus and you dump these antibiotics on them, penicillin and then methicillin, you kill off most of them. You don't kill off all of them. Even the Black Plague, which killed off a third of Europe, didn't kill off everybody, did it? Now, since bacteria reproduce real quick, guess what? You got yourself a problem. Maybe you kill off 99.999% of the bacteria, but those 0.0 whatever I said 1% bacteria that live, they reproduce real quick. And guess what? The reason why they're alive is because they thumb your nose at your antibiotic, penicillin or methicillin. So now you know that doctors and medical facilities are being a little less free with passing out antibiotics, right? Your body's got, for most cases, a good, healthy immune system. Antibiotics may make the cold go away faster, but in the general, they can actually make things worse. Look, methicillin resistance, 2 years. That's how quick these things can reproduce. More on that later. These little bacteria go crazy. This might be the, no, we got a couple more minutes. Homology. All right, now, if you look at the 4 limbs of organisms that are relatively closely related, human, cat, whale, bat, all mammals, right? All mammals, all much more related to each other than, again, us to the plants. If you look at the limbs, in our case, the 4 limbs, and our legs are the same way, and you look at the 4 limbs of these other creatures, there are the same bones. Now, they've been modified, shorter, longer, like in the case of the whale, right? And the bat. Look at the finger bones, the ones in the blue. The phalanges and the metacarpals are your finger bones. They've gotten really long in the whales and the bats. This is what's known as homology. This is an evidence for evolution because this is a modification of a basic plan. You got the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, the carpals, and da-da-da, and you just kind of stretch these, stretch those. If you're a bat, you stick some tissue between the fingers, and if you're a whale, you might do the same thing. And in a human, you don't do that because we want to use our fingers for grabbing stuff, but if you're a bat, you want to use them for flying. Isn't that cool? So homology, that's a good example of evidence for evolution, right? Start with a basic plan. That's not, if you're arguing separate design, then, why not do it separately? Sometimes, as we're going to learn a bit later on, evolutionary adaptations are compromises. They're not perfect. Well, if you're doing separate design, why not make them perfect? If we look at things like comparative anatomy, just let me do this one slide and I'll finish. If we look at like where development is in a chick embryo and a human embryo at about the same relative time, we find similarities between those as well. It's a really cool branch of science or biology called comparative embryology. We basically compare the way different things go through development, from a young offspring development. And for reasons that we'll talk about later on the semester, both the chicken and the human both have pharyngeal arches, and we both have a tail, and we both have some other characteristics too. But if we look at that, that's another evidence for evolution. Again, starting from a basic plan, Darwin, and modifying it. All right. Okay, so let me stop the recording right there.